The first model that we're going to create for our application is going to be the user profile model. The user profile model is going to be used to manage user profiles in our system. So that is creating new users when a user registers, checking a user's credentials when they log in, and deleting a user, so removing the user account. So let's create our user profile model. Load up Atom and make sure that you have the Profiles REST API project open. Now, the standard practice in Django is to put all of the models in a file called models.py. The models.py file is located in the Profiles API app. So every app you create in Django has its own models.py file, and that must contain all of the models specific to that app. So make sure you have the models.py file open, and let's add our model. The model we're going to create is called user profile. And Django, out of the box, actually has its own user model that it uses for its system. So Django has something called a Django admin, which we're going to be using a bit later on in the course. So what we're going to do with our user model is we're going to create a custom user model, and we're going to override the Django's built-in user model. This is called substituting a custom user model. So the reason we do this is so that we can have control over the fields that are required for the user profiles in our system. So the fields that Django has in its standard Django user model is a little bit different from the fields that we want in our application. So we're going to override this, and we're going to have our own user model. So we're going to start by importing a couple of things here at the top. So the first thing we're going to import is we're going to import the abstract base user. The abstract base user is the base of the Django's standard user model. So we're going to import from that. We're going to build on top of it and then make some changes to it. So start typing from django.contrib.auth.models import abstract base user. So this is going to be the base of our user model. The second thing we're going to import is the permissions mixin. The permissions mixin allows us to add permissions to our user model. So the standard Django user model has something called permissions, which lets you set permissions on specific users to say what they can and cannot do in the system. So we want to include that functionality in our own user model. So we're going to import the permissions mixin class. So type from django.contrib.auth.models import permissions mixin, all one word. Okay, so now that we have the imports that we need for our model, let's actually create our first model. So you define the model as a class. So we're going to create a new class called user profile. And we're going to inherit from both of these classes that we imported up here. So we're going to inherit from the abstract base user and the permissions mixin. All right, and I'm going to write a doc string here. So you write a doc string by putting 3 double quotation marks underneath the definition of the class, and you just put a brief description about what this class is going to be for. This is so you and other developers can see easily what the class is about if they're looking at the code. So this class is going to represent a user profile inside our system. Oops, user profile inside our system. Okay, so now that we've defined our class and our doc string, we can start adding fields to our model. So a Django model consists of multiple fields. So the fields are the pieces of data that we want to collect for that object and store in the database. So the first thing we're going to collect for our user profile is the email address. So let's create a field called email. So type email, and then we need to give it a field type. So you get the field types from this models class, which Django already conveniently imports for us when it creates the template file. So there are various different fields available in Django. You can create your own fields too, but that's more of an advanced topic. In the resources of this video, I put a link to the documentation on the Django website that has all the information about the different types of fields available, this model field reference. So this model field reference has a list of all the different fields that you can use in your system. So maybe after this video, if you want to learn more about the fields and the different fields available, then you can have a look at that document. So the field we're going to use for our email field is called the email field. So we're going to type email equals models.email field. And then we're going to set some attributes on the email field. The first one is the max length. This is required for the email field and all char fields in the system. So we're going to set the max length to the maximum possible of 255. And then we're going to set another attribute called unique. So this unique basically says that each user has to have a unique email address. So only one email address can be in the system at a time. All right, so the next field we're going to use is the name field. So type name equals models dot, and this time we're going to use a char field. And the same as the email, we're going to give it a max length of 255. So this max length will not only restrict the length of the item that we put in that text to 255, but it will help us with the different validation on the field as well. So you'll see later on in the course how the validation of these field items goes all the way through to our API. So if a user enters something longer than 255 characters, it will give them a nice error message that's easy to understand. Okay, so now that we have the email and the name, let's create the isActive field. IsActive is used to determine whether a particular user is currently active in the system. So you can use it to disable user accounts. It's a requirement when you replace when you add a custom user model to Django. So it should say is active models dot, and this time we're going to use a Boolean field. Boolean field simply has a true or false value. The attribute we're going to set in this field is a default. So a default is a default value that's assigned when no value is provided. So if you were to try and create a model, a user profile model, without an isActive field, it will automatically set it as true. Next, we're going to set the isStaff field. So type is_staff. And again, this is going to be a Boolean field. But the difference this time is that the default is going to be false, because we don't want new users coming into the system as staff members. isStaff is another field that's used by the Django user model, and it's required when you substitute the Django user model for our own model. Okay, so now that we've defined all of the fields that are required for our model, let's set an object manager. So an object manager is another class that we can use to help manage the user profiles. So it will give us some extra functionality like creating an administrator user or creating a regular user. And again, it's required when substituting the custom user model in Django. So you define that by typing objects equals user profile manager. We're going to create user profile manager in the next lesson. All right, so now there's a couple more attributes that we need to set on our user profile model class. The first one is username field. The username field is the field that's going to be used as the username for this user. So the standard Django user model has something called a username field. The username field is like a handle, or it's what the user uses to log in as. We're going to be replacing that with the email address, because we want our users to be able to log in with the email address instead of a custom username. I always find that email addresses are easier for people to remember. All right, next we're going to define the required fields. So this is a list of fields that are required for all users, all user profile objects in the system. So type required, all uppercase, required fields equals, and this is a list of strings. So you can define as many required fields as you like. In this case, we're only going to require the name. The reason we're only going to require the name is because the email address is already a required field in the system. Because it's the username field, it's by default set to required. Okay, so now we're going to create a couple of helper functions for our model. The first helper function is called getFullName. This is a function that we can use to get the full name of the user in the system. Start by typing def to define the function, and then the function name, get underscore name, get underscore full underscore name. And then put self here in the brackets after it because it's a class function. All right, so again, we're going to define a doc string here. So we're going to put 3 double quotes, and in between the 3 double quotes, we're going to put used to get a user's full name. So this is again used by the Django admin. We're going to be going on to the Django admin in a future lesson. But for now, you just need to understand that this getFullName field is required, or this getFullName function is required to use our custom user profile with the Django admin. So we need to return what we want to show as the full name of the user. In our case, we're just going to return self.name. So self gets the base object and name is this field here. Next, we need to define a getShortName function. So we're going to type def to define a function, get underscore short underscore name, self, and a doc string here. So 3 quotes, and then we'll type used to get a user's short name, and then end it with 3 quotes. And for this, we're also going to return the name, self.name. If we had a different type of name, or we had a first name and last name as a separate field, we could return the first name and last name in the full name and just the first name in the short name. That's an example of how you may do it. But in our case, because we only have one name field, we're just going to return the name as the short name. Okay, so now let's add our final function to our model. Final function is called the str function, and this is a function that's required in Django so it knows how to return our object as a string. So in Python, if we want to print a user profile object and we want to print it in a nice way, we need to tell it which field we need to show when we print our user profile model. So start by typing def and then 2 underscores, an str, another 2 underscores, and then open the brackets and type self. Again, I'm going to put a doc string here. So that's 3 quotes, and then Django uses this when it needs to convert the object to a string, 3 quotes. Okay, and I think for this, we should return the email address because the email address is unique, whereas the name is not unique. So if we ever want to see a unique, or we want to print an object and know which username it refers to, then we look at the email address. So let's type return self.email. Okay, so I'm just going to go over what we've done to recap. So we created a user profile class in the models.py. We inherited from the abstract base user and the permissions mixin. We then created 4 fields: email, name, is active, and is staff. and we assigned an object manager to the objects field, and we set the username field as the email address and the required field as name. So it'll be name and email address because username field is required by default. Then we defined 3 functions on our model. One is to get the full name of the user, one is to get the short name of the user, and lastly, we defined a function to return the object as a string. So that's how you create a model in Python. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next lesson.